War felt strangely familiar, until I witnessed human fury firsthand. The alarm on Deck 7 had been screaming for 40 seconds before anyone silenced it. I was standing at the observation port when the first Vorath missile cluster struck our escort ship, the carrier coalition vessel Draken's Wing. The explosion was clean, almost elegant from a distance, a white bloom in the dark, then a spreading ring of debris that caught the distant starlight and turned it into something that almost looked beautiful. Almost. My name is Velkrath 9. I am a military observer assigned by the Skari Directorate to the Joint Coalition Task Force, specifically, to the human detachment under command of Major Elise Akafer. My role is to watch, record, and report. I have observed 12 armed conflicts across 3 star systems. I have watched 3 species go to war and 2 more surrender. I believed, with the deep confidence of experience, that I understood what war looked like. The Draken's Wing finished breaking apart before anyone on the bridge spoke a word. Then a human voice, calm and flat, said, "Confirmed loss of Draken's Wing, logging it, moving on." That was Petty Officer Dan Cole, 24 years old, from a place on Earth called Bristol. He had a photograph of a dog pinned to his console. I remember thinking that the photograph was a strange thing to bring to a war. I remember thinking a lot of things about humans in those early days that I later had to revise entirely. The Vorath hegemony had been pressing into coalition space for 3 years before I arrived. They were a methodical species, gray-skinned, long-limbed, with 4 eyes that gave them excellent peripheral vision and absolutely zero warmth. They fought the way they governed, with layers, with patience, with the quiet certainty that if you simply applied enough pressure over enough time, anything would eventually give way. They had broken the Marathi Federation in 8 months. They had absorbed 2 border worlds from the Skari without a single ground engagement. They were winning this war the way a stone wins against water, by simply refusing to move. The humans had been fighting them for 14 months. They had not broken. I found this statistically improbable. I found a great many things about humans statistically improbable in those early weeks. The way they kept photographs in a war zone. The way they named their equipment, not designation codes, actual names, as though a plasma cannon was a person with feelings about the matter. A sergeant called Pete Harlow had named his rifle Geraldine and referred to it in conversation. I recorded this and filed it under unclear cultural practices, further observation required. They also laughed, not the nervous laughter of creatures trying to manage fear, though they did that too, but genuine, easy laughter, even in the hours after bad news. I watched Corporal Nina Walsh, whose bunkmate had been killed in a Vorath ambush 2 days prior, sit in the mess hall and laugh until tears ran down her face at something Petty Officer Cole had said. I watched this and felt something close to confusion. By Skari response protocols, she should have been in a grief cycle for at minimum 6 solar days. She was back at her post in 3 hours. Major Akafer was the most difficult human for me to classify. She was 38 years old, compact, with dark eyes that missed very little and a voice that never rose above the level it needed to be. She did not perform her authority. She did not remind people of her rank. She simply spoke, and people did what she said, and I slowly came to understand that this was because they trusted her with their lives in a way that went beyond training or regulation. It was something older. I asked her, in our 2nd week together, how she managed her unit's emotional states in a sustained combat environment. She looked at me for a moment and then she said, "I don't manage them, I know them." I wrote this down. I did not fully understand it yet. Karath's Reach was a colony world, cold, rocky, with a thin atmosphere that required outdoor workers to use breathing filters for anything longer than an hour. 41,000 people lived there, mostly miners and their families. It had no strategic value that my models could identify, no rare minerals in significant quantities, no tactical position that could not be replicated elsewhere. When the Vorath encircled it with a siege ring of 11 warships and 30,000 ground troops, Coalition Command ran the numbers and called it a write-off. The meeting where this decision was communicated was brief. The senior coalition admiral, a Scari named Veldrostu, a distant relation, as these things are measured, laid out the resource cost of a relief operation versus the strategic value of the target and concluded that the numbers did not support it. Major Okafor sat through the entire presentation without speaking. When Veldrostu finished, she asked one question. She asked how many of the 41,000 were children. The number was 12,400. She thanked the admiral for his time. Then she left the room and went back to her maps. I followed her because that was my job. She was standing over the tactical table when I arrived, her hands on the edge of it, looking at the holographic representation of Karath's Reach with its red siege ring pulsing slowly around it. She did not look like someone who had just been told to abandon 12,000 children to an occupying force. She looked like someone doing a calculation. "We're going," she said without looking up. I asked her what resource base she planned to use, given that Coalition Command had declined support. She said, "The resources I have." Then she started making calls. I stood there in the blue light of the tactical display and watched her begin building something from nothing, pulling in favors and promises and the kind of stubborn personal credibility that cannot be manufactured. She called ship captains by their first names. She called supply officers at 2 in the morning. She called a pilot named Grace, who apparently owed her something significant from an incident on a previous deployment that neither of them was willing to specify in detail. By the time I left for my rest cycle that night, she had commitments from 3 ship captains, a logistics officer, and one very confused artillery team that had not been expecting to be relevant again for several weeks. I lay in my bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about the math. The numbers did not support what she was doing. The models did not support it. The strategic calculus was entirely against her. And then, for the first time in my career as an observer, I thought, perhaps the models are missing something. I did not sleep well. Humans, I had noticed, seemed to sleep extremely well the night before terrible decisions. I filed this under unclear cultural practices as well and closed my eyes and waited for morning. The alarm did not wake me. I was already awake. I had observed 15 ground engagements before Karath's Reach. I want to be precise about this, because I want to be clear that when I say what followed was unlike anything I had recorded before, I am making a statement grounded in extensive experience and not in shock alone. The approach to Karath's Reach took 31 hours. For the first 20 of those hours, nothing happened that I could not have predicted. The task force, 3 human ships, 1 Scari observer vessel, and a repurposed cargo hauler carrying the artillery team that Grace had borrowed from a depot that officially had no record of them, moved through contested space with the careful patience of people who knew that patience was currently their only asset. I spent those hours at the observation post, cataloging. The human soldiers prepared for engagement in ways that were individually unremarkable. They checked equipment, they reviewed tactical maps, they ran through scenarios, but they also did other things. Corporal Nina Walsh painted her name on the inside of her helmet in small, neat letters, not on the outside where it would be visible to others, on the inside where only she could see it. I found this deeply curious. When I asked her about it, she said, "So I remember who I'm coming home as." I wrote that down and stared at it for a long time. Sergeant Leon Hayes, the youngest sergeant in the unit, 22 years old with a habit of tapping his knee when he was thinking, spent 2 hours writing something in a small notebook. Not tactical notes, something personal. When he finished, he folded it carefully, sealed it, and handed it to the ship's medic with instructions that it should only be opened under a specific condition. The medic took it without comment. This was, I gathered, not an unusual exchange. Sergeant Pete Harlow, the one who called his rifle Geraldine, sharpened a blade he almost certainly did not need to sharpen, Because modern engagement at the distances they would be fighting made handheld blades largely ceremonial. He sharpened it anyway, with a small, flat stone he kept in his jacket pocket, with the focused attention of a craftsman working on something that mattered. I did not understand any of this. I understood it later. Major Akaffer spent the final hours before contact at the tactical table, and I was with her for most of them. She did not sleep. She did not appear to need to. She studied the Vorath siege line with the particular attention of someone looking not for where the line was strong, but for where it believed itself to be strong, which, she had once explained to me, was a different question. "They're methodical," she said at one point, not really to me, but I was there and I answered. I agreed. The Vorath were extremely methodical. "Methodical means predictable," she said. "Predictable means there are places they haven't prepared for, because they don't think anyone would go there." I asked where those places were. She pointed to 3 locations on the map. One was a narrow canyon passage with almost no room for vehicle movement. One was an open plain with no natural cover for 4 kilometers in any direction. One was directly under the primary artillery installation on the eastern ridge. I stared at these 3 locations. I said, "Those are the most dangerous approaches on the map." She said, "Yes," and then she smiled, and I still do not entirely know what to make of that smile. The Vorath siege line around Karath's Reach was 11 ships in orbital positions and 30,000 troops on the ground, arranged in a layered defensive formation that would, by standard military doctrine, have required a force 3 times our size to break through with acceptable losses. The Vorath had held siege lines like this before. They had held them against species that brought more ships, more soldiers, more supplies. They held them by bleeding the attacker slowly, patiently, the way you drain a reservoir not all at once, but steadily, until the attacking force decided the cost was too high and withdrew. They had held every siege they had ever laid. We broke the outer picket line at 3:40 hours, local colony time. The engagement lasted 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes I saw the first thing that I could not explain. The human vessels did not approach in the tactical formation I had been briefed on. They approached in a formation that my models flagged as suboptimal, tight, aggressive, with no fallback positioning for the rear ship. I mentioned this to the ship's navigator, a tall, quiet man called Oliver Webb, who had been navigating combat approaches for 9 years, and had a row of small marks on his console that I had initially taken for decoration before I realized they were tallies. He looked at my analysis and said, "Yeah, it looks wrong until it works." I asked him what happened if it didn't work. He said, "Then we were right and it looked wrong." Then he returned his attention to the controls, entirely untroubled. The formation worked. The picket line broke in the exact location Akaffer had predicted, and our 3 ships pushed through at a speed that the Vorath defensive grid had not been configured to intercept. They had prepared for a measured advance. The humans did not advance in a measured way. The first hour of ground engagement was, by the standards of what came later, quiet. The human units pushed through the canyon approach, the dangerous one, the one the Vorath had not fortified because they had not believed anyone would use it, and established a forward position with a speed that surprised even our own tactical models. I was watching the progress markers update and calculating that the mission was, so far, running approximately 40% ahead of projected schedule. Then the ambush hit. The Vorath had positioned a reserve unit in a dry riverbed 2 kilometers inside the canyon, the kind of static waiting position that requires patience and discipline to hold for days at a time without moving. The Vorath were good at patience. They had held that position for 62 hours. When our lead elements came through the canyon, the Vorath sprang the trap from 3 sides at once, and for approximately 90 seconds, the tactical map looked like a catastrophe. I watched the position markers for the lead platoon go red, amber, red again. I watched Akafar's face as the casualty reports began coming in: 4 injured, 1 critical, 2 unable to confirm status. She did not change expression. Her jaw tightened, barely noticeably. Her eyes moved across the map with the focused speed of someone processing information very quickly. Then she said into the comm, "First platoon, don't stop moving. Stay in contact and keep moving north. They can't flank what doesn't slow down." And then the strangest thing happened. They didn't stop. By every model I have for unit behavior under that level of contact, crossfire from 3 positions, casualties confirmed, communications fragmented, the correct response is to seek cover, consolidate, call for reinforcement, and wait for the situation to clarify. Every species I have observed does this. It is not cowardice. It is basic operational logic. The humans moved north. Through the ambush. Not around it, not back through the canyon, through it, at a pace that forced the Vorath ambush positions to break their static hold and reposition. And a static defensive position that starts moving is not a defensive position anymore. I watched the Vorath flanking units begin to shift, and I watched the tactical model recalculate, and I watched the ambush, the carefully prepared 62-hour ambush, dissolve in 11 minutes. Corporal Nina Walsh's team came through last, pulling the critical casualty with them. She had a wound on her left arm that she had bandaged herself during the movement and had not mentioned to anyone. I reviewed the helmet camera footage later. She had bandaged it without slowing down. The Vorath Reserve Commander, I learned afterward from captured communications, had reported to his superiors that the human unit had failed to respond correctly to contact. I have thought about that phrase many times. I understand exactly what he meant. I also understand exactly why it was the last useful communication he sent before his position was overrun. We reached the intermediate staging point at 6:12 hours, ahead of schedule, with casualties but ahead of schedule. Leon Hayes sat down on a piece of broken equipment and pulled out his notebook and wrote something else in it. I didn't ask what. Pete Harlow ran his thumb along the edge of his blade. Geraldine was resting against his knee and looked at the middle distance with the calm expression of someone who had done what they came to do and was already thinking about the next thing. Dan Cole updated the casualty log and said, in the same flat voice he used for everything, "Ahead of pace. Good." Oliver Webb over the comm from orbit said, "Nice work down there." Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. They drank water, checked their equipment, helped the injured to the medic, and waited for Akafar's next instruction. I stood at the edge of the staging area and looked at them and tried to find the right word for what I was observing. I had many words for military units. I had words for brave units, for disciplined units, for units that fought well or poorly, that held or broke. I did not have a word for this. I added it to my list. It was on the 3rd day that I began to understand the difference between what I had thought I was seeing and what I was actually seeing. The relief column had made strong progress through the first 2 days. We had broken through 2 additional Vorath defensive lines, reached a forward supply point that hadn't been expected to be accessible for another 48 hours, and established communications with the colony's defense coordinator, a woman named Ruth Carver, who had been organizing civilian defense with the calm efficiency of someone who had refused to stop believing help was coming even when Coalition Command had stopped believing it was worth sending. Ruth Carver's first words when the comm line opened were not a request for evacuation or supplies or reinforcement. Her first words were, "I told them you'd come." I do not know who she was addressing. I think possibly she was addressing the empty air or some version of herself from 3 days ago who had needed to believe it. Major Akafar said, "Still some way to go, Ruth, hold tight." Ruth Carver said, "We've been holding for 19 days, we're good at it." I noted this exchange in my log and moved on. I should have stayed with it longer. I understand that now. The third day was where the pattern broke. We had been operating on a workable, if difficult, situation, pushing through defenses that the Vorath had designed to slow us, taking losses that hurt but did not stop us, maintaining a pace that the Vorath models had apparently not been prepared for. And then, at 11:40 hours on day 3, the Vorath made a decision that changed the shape of everything. They had a prepared reserve, a secondary force they had held back behind the siege line, away from our line of advance, positioned to come in from the flank once we were committed. It was a sound tactical choice. If I had been advising the Vorath commander, I would have recommended exactly that. The reserve hit our right flank while we were pushing against the main line. In 11 minutes, coalition forces lost 2 ships in orbit, 1 Scari, 1 human, and on the ground, 40% of the human unit's strength was cut off in a low area between 2 ridges, surrounded on 3 sides by Vorath ground forces, with no orbital support and no clear extraction route. I was on the command carrier when it happened. I watched the tactical display as the position markers shifted and the cut-off units went to emergency beacon status. I watched the Scari senior officer present, a capable and experienced commander named Velshin 4, look at the board and make the calculation that any reasonable observer would make. "Recommend consolidation," he said. "Pull back to defensible line, regroup, wait for reinforcement." It was the right recommendation. By every model I had ever used, it was correct. Akafar was looking at the board with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was not panic. It was not despair. It was something very focused and very still, and it frightened me slightly in a way I could not account for, because she was not doing anything alarming. She was just standing there looking at the board. Then she picked up the comm. She did not call a command channel. She called Sergeant Leon Hayes by name. She called Corporal Nina Walsh by name. She called a junior soldier in Walsh's unit, a young man called Adam Cooper, 18 years old on his first deployment, by name. She called 7 more of them by name, going down the cut-off unit's roster like someone checking on friends, not like a commander assessing assets. Hayes's voice came back scratchy through the interference. "Still here, ma'am. We're good." He was not good. I could see his position on the board. He was in a drainage canal with 11 people and Vorath units within 400 meters. But he said he was good, and his voice was steady, and something in Akafar's posture shifted when she heard it. She said, "I'm coming to get you." Velshin 4 said, with the measured tone of someone trying to be helpful, "Major, the tactical picture does not support." She turned and looked at him, just looked at him, not with hostility, with something that was, in its own way, more direct than hostility. She said, "I heard your recommendation," and then she turned back to the board. I had served alongside Scari officers of considerable experience and authority. I had watched senior commanders redirect resources, override plans, override each other. I had never watched someone simply be looked at and fall silent. But Velshin 4 fell silent, and he stayed silent. And later, when I asked him about it, he said he had decided that in that particular moment, the recommendation he had already made was sufficient, and further repetition was unlikely to be helpful. I believe he was correct. Akafar began pulling together what she had. It was not much. A third of her unit was committed to holding the forward line. Another portion was occupied with the injured from the morning's engagement. What remained was a collection of people that, in an honest assessment, did not constitute a relief force in any conventional sense. It constituted a surgeon named Dr. Paul Grant, who had never been in a ground engagement but picked up a weapon with the expression of someone doing an unpleasant but necessary thing. It constituted Oliver Webb, who had come down from orbit when his ship was destroyed, and who was, technically, a naval navigator with minimal ground training. It constituted Grace, the pilot who owed Akafar a favor, who had been standing in a supply corridor when the board lit up and had walked directly to Akafar and said, "What do you need?" It constituted Pete Harlow, who picked up Geraldine and fell in without being asked. It constituted Dan Cole, who updated the casualty log one more time, noted his own name as active, and closed his notebook. I watched this assembly with the feeling, unfamiliar and faintly alarming, that I was watching something I did not have a category for. Akafar looked at them, then she looked at me. I had not moved toward them. I was an observer. My role was to watch. She said, "Velkrath, you can stay here." I looked at the board. I looked at the drainage canal where Leon Hayes and 11 people were surrounded in the dark. I said, "I will come." She did not look surprised. She nodded once and moved toward the exit. I followed. The distance between our position and the cutoff unit was 2.3 kilometers. The ground between was not open. It was a broken landscape of collapsed mining infrastructure, scattered rock formations, and the kind of darkness that comes when the only light is from things that are trying to destroy you. And I walked it with a human combat surgeon, a naval navigator, a pilot who owed someone a favor, a sergeant who talked to his rifle, a petty officer with a tally on his console, and a major who had decided that the tactical picture was not the only picture. None of them spoke much. The ones who spoke at all spoke quietly, practically, checking positions, sharing observations, nodding cover. There was no rousing of spirits. There was no manufactured courage. There was simply the sound of people moving through difficulty because they had decided they were going to. I have recorded many things in my career. That walk is the one I return to most often. Halfway there, we encountered a Vorath scout element, a small unit sent to confirm the cut-off group's position. It was a sharp, brief engagement in the dark, and when it was finished, Dr. Paul Grant had a graze on his shoulder that he examined with professional detachment and declared manageable, and Grace had expended ammunition that she quietly refilled from a fallen Vorath soldier's supplies without any visible discomfort about this practicality. Oliver Webb had shot well. I noted this in my log with some surprise. He explained afterward that navigation and accuracy shared certain mathematical principles. I am not sure this is true. I think he had simply decided to be capable of the thing that was required. We reached the drainage canal at 1:40 hours. Leon Hayes looked up when Akafar came down the slope toward him. He had a cut above one eye and the look of someone who had been awake for a very long time. He looked at the group behind her, the surgeon, the navigator, the pilot, the sergeant with his rifle, the petty officer, and he looked back at Akafar. He said, "That's everyone." She said, "That's what we had." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, what's the plan?" That was the moment I began to understand. Not the tactics, not the engagement that followed, not the outcome, all of that came later. But that moment, Hayes in a drainage canal, surrounded, outnumbered, having waited in the dark for hours, looking at a relief force that was not what anyone would have called adequate, and his first question was, "What is the plan?" Not, "Is this enough?" Not, "Are we going to make it?" Not any of the questions a reasonable creature under those circumstances would ask. What is the plan? Because the plan was the next thing. And if there was a next thing, there was a way forward, and a way forward was all he needed. I sat with my back against the canal wall in the dark, and I looked at these humans around me, tired, hurt, still moving, still asking what is the plan. And I felt the categories I had built over 14 years of military observation begin, quietly, to come apart. It began at 2:40 hours, and it began with Akafar sitting on a piece of broken pipe at the edge of the drainage canal, holding a comm unit, asking Coalition Command for orbital support and resupply. The reply took 4 minutes. 4 minutes is not long, it felt long. The reply was no. The reasoning was clear and, from a resource allocation standpoint, defensible. The coalition had lost 2 ships. The push on Karath's reach was already overprojected. Reinforcing a compromised forward element with limited extraction options was not strategically justified given the current asset picture. I understood the reasoning. I have produced reasoning like it myself, in other conflicts, in other reports. It is the kind of reasoning that is correct on paper and true in the aggregate, and does not mean that the 41,000 people on Karath's Reach are less real. Akefir sat with the comm in her hand for a moment after the reply ended. Then something happened that I have turned over in my mind many times since, trying to understand it properly. She laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not a performance, a short, real sound, like someone who had just had something confirmed that they had already half expected. And then she set the comm down on the pipe beside her. She looked at the people around her. Hayes with the cut above his eye, Walsh with the bandaged arm she had not mentioned, Cooper, the 18-year-old on his first deployment, who was sitting against the canal wall with his knees drawn up and his eyes open, watching her, Grant, Webb, Grace, Harlow, Cole. She said, "Command said no, so we're doing it ourselves." And then she said, "Here's what we have and here's where we're going." 4 sentences. I counted. I have included them in 11 subsequent reports and 3 formal presentations to the SCARI Directorate, and I will not put them here because they are not the point. The point is what those sentences did. I cannot explain it as a chemical process, though I have tried. I have interviewed 11 of the people who were present that night, and every account differs in small details and agrees on the core one. Something moved through that canal. Some current that was not sound, or not only sound. Every person in that drainage ditch sat up straighter. Not dramatically, there was no surge of noise or visible transformation. They just straightened, and then they began to check their equipment and move into position. Len Hayes stood up and looked at Akefir and said, "First platoon's with you." It was 11 people. 11 people in a drainage canal in the dark, with limited ammunition, no orbital support, and 2 kilometers of hostile ground between them and the colonists they had come to reach. They moved out at 2:57. I have reviewed the telemetry from that engagement more times than I can count. I have also been present for it, which is a different kind of record, and the two together still do not entirely explain what I saw. So I will describe it as plainly as I can and allow the description to carry what it carries. The Vorath encirclement of the colony's outer perimeter was held by approximately 400 soldiers in a ring formation, with supporting heavy weapons on the northern and southern flanks. They had held that ring for 19 days. They were disciplined, experienced, and by every measure I had available, more than sufficient to hold it for however much longer was required. They had not been designed to respond to what came from the east. The human units, the cut-off first platoon, plus the relief element Akefir had brought, hit the eastern arc of the ring at 3:12, and they hit it in a way that I am going to describe carefully because I want to be precise. They were loud. I mean this not as a judgment but as an observation. The Vorath fight quietly, coordinated, controlled, low communication traffic, minimum noise. Every species I have observed in combat manages its sound, because sound is information and information is risk. I had assumed this was universal. It is not. The humans came through the dark making noise. Coordinated noise. There were signals and calls between units, tactical communications, all of it intentional. But the overall volume of their approach was something my audio sensors had to recalibrate for, because my baseline had been set to the quieter range of what I considered normal. And beneath the tactical communication there was something else, something I cannot describe as anything other than what it was. The sound of people who had stopped calculating and started committing. It is difficult to put into precise language. I have tried and been dissatisfied with every attempt. The closest I can come is this. There is a sound that living things make when they are afraid, and there is a different sound they make when the fear has become something else, not its absence, but its fuel. The humans made the second sound. The Vorath Eastern Arc was 400 soldiers. It had held against everything for 19 days. It held against this for 26 minutes. I was not at the perimeter. I was still in the canal with Dr. Grant, who had stayed back with the most severely injured. I was listening to the calm traffic and watching the position markers on a handheld unit, and I was doing what I was trained to do, which was observe and record. I am going to note here, for the record, that at 3:18 hours I set down my recording unit and simply listened. I am recording this deviation from protocol because I believe it is relevant. In 14 years of observation, I had never set down my recording unit during an active engagement. I do not fully know why I did it. I think I did it because whatever was happening out there deserved to be heard properly, not filtered through equipment. I think I understood on some level that I was present at something, and presence matters in ways that recording does not fully capture. The Vorath siege commander's first distress communication went out at 3:21 hours, 9 minutes after the Eastern Arc contact. His second communication, 6 minutes later, requested permission to reposition his northern flank to respond to the eastern pressure. This was denied. His third communication, 4 minutes after that, was a ceasefire request. The siege of Karath's Reach had been running for 19 days, 3 hours and 41 minutes. It ended at 3:31 hours. I do not know exactly what the Vorath saw in those 26 minutes that made a 400-position ring choose to stop. I have read the captured after-action reports. I have read the Vorath commander's account. He wrote that his forces had encountered an irrational engagement pattern, that his defensive doctrine had no response procedure for. He wrote that the attacking force had continued to advance despite casualties, and despite the absence of the tactical advantages normally required for an engagement of that scale. And then he wrote one sentence that I have thought about more than any other piece of military writing I have encountered in my career. He wrote, "We had prepared for many types of soldiers. We had not prepared for soldiers to whom preparation does not matter." I read that and I thought, yes, that is exactly right. And I also thought, and you never will prepare for it, because preparation assumes a predictable actor, and these are not predictable actors, they are something else. At 3:38 hours, Leon Hayes found me in the canal and told me that the perimeter was open. He looked tired in a way that sleep would fix. He had the cut above his eye and something new on his hand that he was not paying any attention to. He looked at me and said, "You all right?" I considered this question for a moment. I said, "I am uncertain." He nodded. "Yeah," he said, "that's normal after something like that." I did not tell him that I had observed many somethings like that. I did not tell him that I had never before had this response to one. I simply stood up and followed him out of the canal and into the morning, which was arriving over the eastern ridge in long gray light, and ahead of us the colony of Karath's Reach was still standing. It was still standing. The evacuation took 41 hours. I spent most of them moving, because there was always something to move toward, supply lines to help carry, medical triage to assist with, translation needed between coalition officers and colonists who had been through 19 days of siege, and were running on a fuel that had no technical name. I have since heard humans call that fuel relief. The word sounds too simple for what it describes. But then, many human words sound too simple for what they describe, and yet they carry the weight perfectly. 38,400 colonists were evacuated through the breached perimeter over those 41 hours. 2,600 had not survived the siege. Each of those 2,600 had a name, and the human units knew this. And before we left the surface of Karath's Reach, the human units spent 4 hours in a ceremony for those names that I will not attempt to summarize, except to say that I attended from the edge of the gathered group and stayed until the last word was spoken. I am Skari. We have our own practices for the dead. I am not suggesting the human approach is superior or more correct. I am nodding that I stayed, and that staying felt like the right thing to do. And that this is the first time in my career that I have made a decision about ceremony based on what felt right rather than what protocol required. My official report on the Karath's Reach operation was submitted 14 days after the evacuation completed. It was 37 pages. It contained a full tactical breakdown of all 5 major engagements, an analysis of human unit performance against Vorath defensive doctrine, a resource and outcome assessment that the Directorate had specifically requested, and a set of 11 recommendations ranging from revised joint training protocols to a complete reassessment of human military classification within the Coalition framework. I recommended elevating the human Coalition forces to Tier 1 strategic asset status, which is a classification that, before this assignment, I had applied to only 2 species in my reporting history. The Directorate approved the recommendation in full. I also wrote a personal appendix. This was not requested. It is not standard practice in Skari military reporting. I wrote it anyway and included it without asking permission, and the review board flagged it as outside protocol and then, apparently, read it and forwarded it to 4 additional recipients, which is also outside protocol. In the appendix, I wrote about Ruth Carver, who had told her people for 19 days that help was coming, and who, when it arrived, did not say, "Thank you for coming." She said, "I knew you would." I wrote about what it means to believe something not because the evidence supports it, but because you have decided to believe it, and how that decision can become a kind of bridge that holds weight that logic alone cannot carry. I wrote about Leon Hayes and his notebook. I later learned what he wrote in it because he told me when I asked directly. In the first entry before the operation began, he had written a letter to his daughter who was 4 years old and living with her mother in a city on Earth called Edinburgh. He had written it in case he did not come back. In the second entry, halfway through the operation, he had written a single line. It said, "Still coming home." In the third entry, which he wrote in the canal while waiting for Akafar to arrive, it said, "Told you." I wrote about Dr. Paul Grant, who had come out of his medical bay and walked into a ground engagement because the people who needed to be retrieved were on the other side of one, and who had, in the days after, gone back to his surgical bay and resumed his work with the same quiet focus, as though the 2 things were simply adjacent responsibilities of the same job. I wrote about Grace, whose full name I eventually learned was Grace Aliner Hodge, who owed Akafar a favor from an incident involving a misdirected supply convoy and a misappropriated atmospheric shuttle on a station called Pell Crossing, and who had paid that favor back in full, and in the returning, demonstrated that it had never really been about the debt. I wrote about Oliver Webb, who taps a tally mark on his console after each approach, and who navigated a combat ground approach on foot with the same precision he would apply to orbital plotting, because, he told me, precision is precision regardless of the medium. I wrote about Pete Harlow and Geraldine, and about how I had initially recorded the nomming of equipment as an unclear cultural practice. I want to state clearly in this appendix that I now understand it. When you are going somewhere dangerous, you take things with you that mean something. The meaning is not in the object. The meaning is in the act of assigning it. It is a way of saying, I am present here, this matters. I am paying attention to what I am doing and to the things around me. Geraldine is not a rifle. Geraldine is Pete Harlow's relationship with the thing he carries into difficulty. I believe this is important. I wrote about Dan Cole, who said moving on when the Draken's wing was destroyed, and who I initially read as cold, and whom I now understand was doing something different. He was not dismissing the loss. He was holding it and continuing. Those are not the same act, but they look similar from a distance, and I had been observing from a distance, which is what observers do and which is, I now believe, not always sufficient. I wrote about Nina Walsh and the name on the inside of her helmet. I have thought about that name many times, so I remember who I'm coming home as. It is one of the most precise things I have ever encountered in a military context. Not remember who I am, that is assumed. Remember who I am coming home as. There is a version of you that goes in and a version that comes out, and Walsh knew they were different, and she wanted the thread between them to be visible to her at all times. I want to say clearly that I found this practical and not sentimental, and that I have started keeping a similar reminder in my own equipment, and that I do not think this is a small thing. And then I wrote about Major Elise Akefer. I wrote about the moment in the tactical room when she looked at the map of Karath's Reach and said, "We're going," with the calm certainty of someone doing a calculation. I wrote about her phone calls at 2 in the morning. I wrote about the 4 sentences in the canal, which I am still not going to reproduce here, but which I described as direct, specific, honest about the difficulty, and completely absent of any suggestion that the difficulty was a reason not to proceed. I wrote about the moment she turned and looked at Velshin 4 and how he fell silent. I have thought about why that look worked. Velshin 4 is not a person who is easily redirected. He is experienced, confident, and entirely accustomed to being the most capable officer in the room. And she looked at him and he stopped. I believe this is because what she communicated with that look was not authority. It was certainty. And certainty of a particular kind, not the certainty that says I am right. The certainty that says this is already decided. And there is almost nothing more disorienting to a calculating mind than encountering a decision that has already been made, because there is nothing left to calculate. I wrote about Karath's Reach as a concept, separate from Karath's Reach as a location. I wrote, the humans did not go to Karath's Reach because the numbers supported it. They went because the people were there. These are not the same reason. I had spent my career assuming they were equivalent, that a sufficiently strong case for the value of lives would always produce the same motivation as an immediate personal relationship to those lives. I was wrong. The abstract and the specific are different fuels. They produce different accelerations. I ended the appendix with a scene that I did not plan to include, but that kept returning to me, and that I eventually decided I had a responsibility to record accurately. On the second night of the evacuation, I was sitting at the edge of the landing area watching the colonists board the transport ships in long, quiet lines, tired, carrying what they had managed to keep, moving with the careful slowness of people whose legs still worked but whose reserves of everything else were low. And a small girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, I am not certain, I am not reliable on human age estimation, walked past me and stopped and looked up at me. I am Skari. We are physically different from humans in several significant respects. This child had almost certainly never seen my species before. I was, objectively, strange-looking to her. She looked at me for a moment, and then she held out something she was carrying, a small, battered toy, a stuffed animal of some kind, much used. She held it toward me. I did not know what she was offering. I did not know if it was a gift or a request or something I had no category for. I looked at her. She said, "You can hold him for a bit if you want. He's good when things are scary." I took the toy. I held it. She watched me for a moment, apparently satisfied that the transfer was complete, and then she turned and walked back to her family in the line. I held the toy until they boarded. Then I placed it carefully on the ground and stepped back, in case someone came looking for it. Dan Cole was standing nearby. He had seen the whole thing. He looked at me with that quiet, level expression he uses for everything, and he said, "You all right?" I considered the question. I said, "I believe so." He handed me something, a small metal cup, warm in my hands. Coffee, which I had tried twice before and found terrible both times. I drank it, all of it. Cole nodded and went back to work. And I stood there in the landing light, holding the empty cup, watching the last transports lift off from the surface of Karath's Reach, and I thought about all the things I had recorded and all the things I had not. and all the differences between watching and seeing, and all the years I had spent believing that I understood what war was. I had understood its shape. I had not understood what fills it. I know now. I have since been reassigned to 3 additional joint operations with human units. I have observed them in circumstances ranging from routine to extraordinary. In every one, I have found the same thing I found at Karath's Reach, that the numbers they fight with and the numbers that matter to them are not the same numbers, and that the distance between those 2 sets of figures is where their particular kind of capability lies. They are not the strongest species in the coalition. They are not the best equipped. By most technical measures, they are not even the most experienced. But they fight in a way that other species do not, because they are moved by things that other species have learned to keep separate from the mechanics of conflict. And those things, the names on the inside of helmets, the letters in the notebooks, the toys offered to strangers, the laughing in the mess hall the morning after the map turns red, are not weaknesses. I want to say this with the full weight of my professional assessment. They are not weaknesses. They are the engine. When I returned to the Scari Directorate to deliver my final report on the Karath's Reach operation, the review board asked me what single observation I would offer as the most significant finding of my time with the human units. I thought about it for a moment. I had 37 pages of findings and 11 recommendations, and a personal appendix that had been forwarded to 4 recipients outside protocol. I had enough observations to fill 3 times that. I gave them one sentence. I said, humans do not fight to prevent defeat. They fight to return to the people they are going home to. The review board was quiet for a moment. Then the senior reviewer said, "Is that a significant military distinction?" And I said, "It is the only one that matters." I still believe that. I will continue to believe it. And if you are the kind of person who needs proof, I would direct you to a drainage canal on Karath's Reach at 1:40 hours on a very dark morning, where 11 people waited in the cold because a major had told them she was coming. She came. They went home. That is the whole of it.